Got your layers on. All right, I'm gonna do a walkthrough and just sort of.
All right. That's such a nice
Okay, that's him, and that's one of the, that's one of the guys that worked in the studio with him?
So this is Earlonne, and that's Wayne Beaudray.
Oh, okay.
So
Okay.
Wayne's gonna come join us, and I'm gonna.
Oh,
Interview
I
him.
saw him in there. I didn't even
Yeah.
know who he was, I just saw him in there.
Yeah.
He's a handsome devil.
I met him in there, I didn't know, I didn't speak to him, because I spoke to him, but I didn't know who he was. Now I'm looking at him.
Yeah.
And so I started the stream, just so that you guys know. I love the podcast. The book was great, but the podcast,
It's wonderful.
it's
right?
just, it's within the space of 2 minutes, you will laugh and you will sob.
Yeah.
Like uncontrollably sob.
Yeah.
Because some of the stuff is so,
Yeah. You know, before he comes in, but I'll tell you one of the book that I read, because a day loaned it to me. But one of the things that, there's so many things that were striking, but one of the things that struck me was the gentleman, someone told one of the guys that he looked homeless in prison.
Homeless in prison?
That was like,
Yeah, because he was on drugs.
that really, that just hit me like, oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Kid, I couldn't, you know, because I couldn't imagine it. I was like, but that was very, that was just one of the things, but that really stuck with me.
Yeah.
I was like,
You think that it's such a low point already, right? To be in
Absolutely.
prison, but at least you have shelter and.
you know, well, they say, you know, three meals a day and a cot to sleep in and blah, 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 you know, that
Right.
terminology they use, but,
Yeah.
and I know that things go on, but to have someone tell you, you were previously
Boo-hish.
homeless, but when you got to jail, you had this.
nothing but love, Marty.
That was,
Right.
hello,
Hi.
hi, how are you doing?
Can I move a chair for you?
Yeah, here, go ahead.
Okay, so you can come on in. Maybe I'll take a
Keep
couple
our
of
6
these
foot
chairs.
distance.
Yeah, I'll just take one out like
Oh,
this.
yeah.
Right,
Yeah, that's what I'll do. Let's do that. Let's take a couple of these out.
You want to put this as far up as you can so they'll hear because it won't hear.
I've got everything turned on. I'm just trying to keep as much space as possible.
Hello.
How are you?
All right, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Just,
And we've got all the streams up.
I wonder if we can put it to a good. Oh, wow, you're expecting a turn. Oh, no.
I'm gonna take a couple out just so people can enter.
Yeah.
Mr. Beaudray, hi, how are you doing?
Mike is good.
Good.
Mainly because of my kids.
Are we do a fist bump? Or are we-
Mainly because of my kids. My kids are doing great,
Oh,
and
okay.
that makes me so excited. My son's 18 now. My daughter's 16.
Wow.
And you still love them.
I'm not sure they love me as much. Don't get me wrong. The only way I can get my daughter to really talk to me is she's on an app called Instagram.
Instagram. Oh,
Just
come on,
photos
Wayne.
which disappear after a few minutes.
Uh-huh.
And I realized when I was back, she goes to school back east, so I realized when I was back there for Parents' Weekend at her school that she was taking a lot of these photos of herself. And so I asked, well, how many of those do you take? She goes, I don't know, 50, 100 a day. And I'm like,
Whoa!
what? What? So I said, well, I don't have that app on my phone. So she connected with me, so I've got her and my son are my only Instagram partners or whatever. But she sends me photos regularly, not because she wants to, because I am cat sitting her cat, because she's away at school. And so I don't send her a photo of me, I send her a photo of her cat every day. And if she wants to see her cat, there has to be some reciprocity here. So I get daily little Snapchats of my daughter. That is not to communicate, it's not a talk, but it's good and it's better than it was. So how about that?
That's
Better than it was. So I'm happy about that.
You should have a well-behaved cat.
Yes.
Okay.
Actually, my daughter's frustrated because her cat loves me more than she knows it. And she's like, Dad, Milky Way loves you more. I was like,
Milky Way?
Cat whisperer.
Milky Way is the name? That's so great.
thank you.
Do you want a bookmark?
Oh, thank you.
I don't have one for everybody, but with the early birds.
I do it on Spotify. so
Okay.
I don't-
Do you want a bookmark?
I have so many books to read. I'll be out for a while, so.
David?
Thank you.
Sorry, paper?
And if anybody wants to read the book and they haven't read it, I have a copy, and I'd be glad to lend it to you.
Okay,
No, I'll get some. Do we have any scratch paper?
I have
No.
these little papers.
Not down here.
with,
Okay.
No, I'll find something. Oh, don't worry. I'll find something.
Do you have it with you?
Yeah, do you want it?
Yeah, I just had my eyes fixed and now I can see. They took up my eyelids and
Thank
so,
Honey, you can have my book.
oh, okay, I'll give it back.
Oh, I know you will.
They were gonna live stream.
Hi there, darling, how are you?
Oh, this is
Right.
Yeah.
Joanne Sherman said, get out and be with people.
So just
So I thought,
to
well,
make it
the
easier,
game doesn't
I
start
cover
till
the
one.
chairs.
And we're about to stay seated. Right?
Did you read any of this or
I have
listen
to
to
think,
it?
but I can work it out.
If you don't,
Maybe there's no pressure or anything, but it's just.
too much going on.
And I guess when it's
Bring
Oh, I know that.
It's
I can
I go to
listen to
Spotify
the-
when I listen to a
Yeah,
podcast because I couldn't read. And that's very good. It's like having someone read you. You might try that. I've never done another podcast without.
I'm not gonna wear one. 'cause I'm
My
not-
niece
it's
loved
very-
this book and she said I had to.
I'm tripping on it. That's just my choice. You know, everybody's got their thing.
I mean, I completely understand it. I just wanted to know what other people's comfort level was because I'm not a great
Is Nigel here?
either.
Is she coming?
Not today, so I was gonna take my notes. You can go to the library.
She used to go to the Sweden Virgin Church.
Oh, really?
Well, your curse is gonna be
I
on
met her.
or death, so you're gonna have to talk up.
There's a couple events
Believe it or
at the
not,
public library. There's one that's
so
that are on this postcard.
You know, there's 3 different
I think
types
it's
of
optional.
incarceration. You have jail, and you got, it's called reception. You have
The
day longer.
bivalent one?
Well, there's a reception area over the,
Yes. Is it font too
over
small?
the New Year's
Hi.
holiday.
Hey.
The toilet of the reception automatically flushing. It's an industrial toilet.
Oh, my goodness.
48
All
hours
girls.
before they come to fix it.
Interesting,
And when
huh?
those-
Yeah.
Oh, there it is.
Just
What
flush
does
it.
that mean?
Ever since then, I like to medicine one ear.
We didn't sit in
Oh,
there.
no.
Blame it on
It was
me.
there in like
I
slightly
think that there's-
small
But
groups.
it was,
Yeah.
So I'm
it was
sure that
a
means.
strange introduction.
Yeah,
To
I'm
the
sure,
prison system.
I'm sure. I mean, it's kind of a jolting experience anyway, I'm sure. But then to have, plumbing
She
issues
was
on
in
top of
Sa-
that.
she teaches in Sacramento.
Well,
I didn't know that. I
you
worked
know,
on
I see no
project there.
questions.
And,
We're just
Yeah.
pumping.
It's an incredible art scene.
Mm.
Did you know?
No.
Yeah.
I won't give you one more
I was
answer.
quite surprised.
But if I go on too long,
Kind of think it was a backwater.
like I said, I'm a jazz player. I'm an orchestra player, so
There's
you know, if it's my turn to do a solo, I'd solo all day. But, you know, this guy's trying to cut that solo off and move on to the next one.
Sure, no problem.
Sacramento State, and then they had a whole bunch of city colleges type places where, and there's a lot of them.
Do you listen to the daily podcast, the New York Times
the New York Times has a podcast called The Daily.
Mhm.
Do you listen to that
Yep.
one? So today, the one today is about like circadian rhythms
Mhm.
and talking about how like harmful shift work is, like when because your rhythms get off, and like you're saying like hospitals are, like there's like artificial light all the time, and like there's so many noises, and it's like kind of like the worst place to be if you're sick. But I was thinking,
I believe in that 100%. I leave my curtains open so I wake up with the sun,
yeah,
but I also don't turn on my lights at night very much.
Yeah.
Only if I have to, but I try to keep it, I will try to let my
the
system.
natural, yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's like kind of the ideal thing. But it's an interesting, I haven't been, it's an interesting podcast today.
The Daily.
Yeah, have you heard of that?
No.
Yeah, I love the day.
Yeah, it's really great. Like I listen to it almost every day.
Oh, yeah. I'll check it out. Is everyone comfortable if I take my mask off? I think you can probably hear me better, Wayne can hear me better, and I'm quadruple vaccinated.
Nice.
If you-
Nice.
If it matters at all to you. And I had an infection, so quintuple vaccinated, I guess you call it. We're gonna wait for Joanne. I'm Erin, this is Wayne. Thank you all for coming.
But get ready to move, because we're gonna bring those chairs in.
I don't know.
Hi,
Jill.
sorry, you go
Maybe
into
we'll
Calvin
just-
Hall and then you can't get out. Hello, everyone. Good to see you all. Some of you have read the book, and I assume some of you have not, and that is okay. We're glad that you're here. And thank you to Wayne and Erin for being here. Erin is wearing appropriate clothing for the event. So the Racial Equity Initiative here at Calvary decided that, we have always, not always, in the past couple of years, we've done a one church, one book discussion. And so this year, we read This Is Ear Hustle, and it's written by folks who have done a podcast at San Quentin. Wayne Beaudray, who is a member here at Calvary, has spent some time there, and so we're so lucky to have him here. And I just want to open us with a breath and a prayer, so let's breathe. And let us pray. God, we give you thanks that we are able to hear and read the voices of those whose lives might be very different from ours, whose journeys may be different, but with whom we are all connected through you. Open our hearts to your spirit. We give gratitude for Nigel Poor and Earlonne Woods and Wayne Boatwright, and for this Calvary community that helps us to engage in important and sometimes hard discussions. We give you thanks that you have given us the ability to work with different communities to turn our faith into action. This we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Feel free to grab extra chairs if you
Oh,
need them.
please come and sit down.
Yeah, come and sit down. And we are live streaming this, and so if you're sitting close to there, if you could not have side conversations just so they hear Erin and Wayne more than your conversations.
We can always grab extra chairs too.
Yes. Yeah.
See, we didn't need to scooch in.
My God.
We were saying we'd have to scooch in, but the more people come, the more the chairs will fill up, so that's fantastic.
And I know there is like a second wave of people who are on their way too.
Okay. So thanks, Joanne, for leading us off. I'm Erin King, and I'm representing REI, which is the Racial Equity Initiative at Calvary. REI has hosted a number of book and movie discussions, basically beginning at the murder of George Floyd in 2020. We thought it was important to educate ourselves and just discuss the racial dynamic in our world and how it relates to us as a church. Are you having trouble hearing me? Okay. So we decided to do this book because there's a lot of intersectionality between BIPOC and prison. A lot of people of color are incarcerated. So REI thought it fitting to have this book as our next topic of discussion. Can we show some hands who has either read or listened to the book or is listening to the podcast? Great, 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 awesome. So if you haven't read the book, it's about the podcast, which is interviews of people incarcerated and other people affected by people incarcerated. And it's a great kind of insight to prison life and all the things that go on that we don't know about. If like I am someone who really has never interacted with anyone else in prison, and maybe there are some of you here who have not either. But as a church, especially as a Matthew 25 church, we are called to have compassion and understand the life of a prisoner, right? When I was in prison, you came to visit me. So we do other things of that nature with feeding hungry people with the Interfaith Food Pantry and all our other Matthew 25 partners. But until now, I really haven't, as a member of Calvary and as an REI member, I have never really put myself out there and just tried to learn about prison life. So this has been a great eye-opener for me, and I'm really enjoying the podcast. So if you haven't read the book or listened to the podcast, I highly recommend it. It's a really, that's why we're doing it, right? There's also, because it's the One City, One Book read, there's an event at the San Francisco Public Library. If any of you are interested in going, they'll have interviews with the authors of the book, Nigel and Earlonne Woods. It is on November 3rd, 6 to 7:30 p.m. at the San Francisco Public Library. It's first come, first serve. You can go on the website and
It's the main branch.
the main branch, check it out. There's also a Zoom option if you don't want to go and be around people. It could be very, very crowded. It's a very popular book, so.
Oh, they got a discussion there too?
Sorry?
The library downtown?
Yeah, if you
Civic
go,
Center, right?
if
Yes.
you go on the website, it'll give you all the information.
November 3rd, 6 to 7:30 p.m.
Yes. Yes. So, again, thank you all for coming. I want to introduce Wayne Beaudray. He is a member of Calvary, and he also lived at San Quentin. So, hi Wayne, thank you for coming.
That's a nice way of putting it. I'll be honest, I did choose, out of the 30, at that time, 33 prisons in the California system, I selected San Quentin. So that's true. But it wasn't as you can imagine, it wasn't a choice to go to prison. I wanted to go to San Quentin because it was closest to my family. And that was the most important thing to me. My kids were only 6 and 8 when I went to prison. So they were quite young, and I was very worried about them. We talk about community, family's part of a community. I actually joined Calvary back in 1998. My wife and I were married in Rye Presbyterian Church in Rye, New York. Moved here in 98 and were looking for a church and fell in love with Calvary. Our kids went to the preschool here. I was a deacon here and a Sunday school teacher here. So we were very involved in the community before I committed my crime. And have no doubt, crime is what it is. I took a life with my crime. And there's no way to ever make up for that, to make the world equal for that. I terminated a woman's life, took her away from her family And I think what I didn't anticipate, that it also took me away from my family and my children. So 2 families were destroyed by my act. Now, I was a drunk driver, so I wouldn't say, so even though I was active in church, and Dave can attest to that, I guess you would call me a functional alcoholic at the time, right? I had a job, made money, had a good life. But I was drinking, and drinking a lot. So that was the weakness that allowed me to think I could drive and drink at the same time, or to not care about the consequences of driving and drinking. You can't go back in the past. That's where I was. Those were the choices I made. But I actually give a lot of discussions, usually online or a long-form podcast or in writing, about my journey. For the simple fact that I want people to hopefully learn from my experience rather than having to go through it themselves. But, you know, you ask about church, I got to tell you, this community has done everything that Matthew 25 talks about. I've been clothed by this community. I've been fed. I've been housed. There's a member of our community who, since she's not here, I'm not going to mention her name. I call her my personal saint. And every time I see her, I thank her. I've been home for 3 years. Every time I see her, I thank her. Because when I got home, I was going to be released into what's called a drug treatment facility, which is much worse than it sounds, because I didn't have at that time a drug or alcohol or addiction problem. Right, I dealt with that when I was in San Quentin, and this kind woman accepted me into her home, into her in-law unit, let me stay there for free for 5 months, so that I could get a job, get on my feet, get my own apartment. And I had to do it, get my own. But you don't do anything by yourself like we learned today, right? People help you. I am, unfortunately, an old school WASP. My family were French Huguenots who came over in the 1600s. And we don't, neither a lender nor a borrower will be is our philosophy. So asking for help is not an easy thing for me. But thankfully, people help anyway. And I've learned to accept it. So one of the big changes for me since I've come home is just to learn to say yes when people offer something. Say yes when you're asked to come speak. You never know what the impact will be, but that's part of what being a member of the community means, is saying yes. We're going to get to questions and answers later. Okay. Don't worry.
So tell us how you got to know Earlonne and Nigel.
I want to use this opportunity to give you guys a little understanding of how the system really works. So I'll get there in a second. I was lucky, even though I committed a crime that took a life. I spent 90 days in the hospital. I was, in a wheelchair. I had a broken neck, pelvis, fractured my foot, but I took a life, right? I'm not trying to equal the balance score here. But I was able to post bail, which allowed me to live in my house while I convalesced for over a year. The vast majority of people who are arrested cannot afford or are not granted the opportunity for bail. So they're forced to stay in prison even though they haven't been convicted of anything. When I was in county jail, after I went to prison, there's a guy who'd been there for 6 years. Trial was still going on.
Wow.
6 years away from his family, from a job, from anything else. It's heartbreaking when you think of how the system really works versus what you see on TV. On TV, the cops always catch the bad guy. You guys probably don't know that the actual murder closure rate's about 50%. And even that number is not legitimate. Chicago reports 50%. They're only about 23% are actually homicides they caught. The other ones they just took off the books because they were 10 years or older. They called it no judicial action, which meant they couldn't find the person. So these cops don't even catch anybody. Anyway, so facts are my thing. I can't help but get there. Now, Earlonne and Nigel have a very different style than that. So when I was at San Quentin, I worked a number of different jobs because I wanted to do what I could to pay my own way in prison. I don't want anybody to have to pay for me. Now, you only make, my first job paid 12 cents an hour. Okay? My last job paid 32 cents an hour. And I was there for 6.5 years. So don't think you make money in prison. The way I met Earlonne and Nigel was I was what was called the managing editor of a newspaper in prison called the San Quentin News. It has a subscriber base of 35,000 physical newspapers that we send out around the state system. Those papers it's about a 24-page paper that talks mainly about prison issues, criminal justice reform, but also all the restorative justice and rehabilitation programs that people participate in the prison system. It's really a chance for guys to get motivated to learn that they have an option to break that cycle of crime and violence that they exist in and actually make a different choice for their lives. And many of them do. So, yes, please listen to Ear Hustle. It's a podcast. It's free. Just go online, listen to it, or read the book. But read the San Quentin News. It's also online. We get about 12,000 hits a month on the newspaper, and you'll find out about many of the things I'm talking about, and many of the things that Earlonne and Nigel talk about. Their style, again, is different. They're much more storytellers. I'm a facts guy. Can't help myself. I get caught up in understanding how the numbers work. But their stories are so authentic. And I think that's the main thing I would tell all of you, is those stories that you hear on Ear Hustle are real. Those are people telling you their real stories in their own voices to the best of their ability, with the help of Nigel and Earlonne to bring that out of them. The process is much longer than it looks. They don't just sit down and talk. They have a couple weeks where they're working with these guys beforehand to help them get the terminology that they want to speak about, be able to say their own message. And that's the main thing. It's not an instruction so that you can convey a political point on these shows. They want people to be authentic and say what they believe in their own voice, but to be able to do it clearly and hopefully concisely enough that the story can hold together. And so I think what amazed me about Nigel and Earlonne was watching that work that they did in their little studio that they had. The Media Center, it's called, and we have a number of different media programs at San Quentin. And by the way, that's not normal for most prisons. Most prisons have about 3 or 4 volunteer programs, and that's it. San Quentin, at its height before COVID, had over 120 different organizations holding approximately 200 meetings a month in San Quentin, where volunteers would come in and run those programs. And some of those programs included media issues. Like, I was a member of the Northern California Journalism Association. So is Earlonne, so is Nigel, right? Because it's a news story. And that organization would come in and help train us to do media in new ways, including podcasts, videos, and writing, which is, again, writing was my focus as the managing editor. I wrote 100 articles for the San Quentin News as well, but that ability to help people learn how to communicate, to tell their own story, is something that's missing in most of these people's lives before they get to a place like San Quentin. And that's a big driver of that frustration and that anger and that lashing out, is they're not able to express themselves in a nonviolent way many times, in my opinion. So Nigel and Earlonne were working in that center with me. I got to watch them work, got to chat and joke with them. This is, well, the photo of it before was me. There's the San Quentin News. Please go there, just sanquentinnews.com. Earlonne and I, he called me his only conservative friend. I don't consider myself that conservative. I consider myself conscientious. For example, if there's a law, you should obey it.
It's a
Right.
Presbyterian thing, right?
I feel that way, right? But that came across to him in a very different way. But we were able to get along and know each other. I was kind of a utility player for Ear Hustle. I've been on there 3 times on the podcast. Because whenever they couldn't find somebody to talk about a topic, they'd come ask me. Like, oh, sure, I'll talk about that, whatever you want. But the topics were real and authentic that we were able to share with each other and broadcast. And some of them are hard topics. Most of them are hard topics. Don't expect sunshine and kumbaya stuff on those podcasts. But you're going to hear what people really go through. Maybe what really got them there. Maybe what their real experience has been like. If anybody's listened to it, do you remember a guy named Curtis Roberts? Does that name ring a bell? Curtis Roberts was on a 3-strike thing. So his 3rd crime was a minor crime. He stole like, I don't know, $100 out of a cash register or something. No weapon. And he was put in prison for life. Now that sounds harsh. But I wrote an article about Curtis Roberts in the newspaper. He tried to commit suicide a number of times. The despondency that comes from not knowing if you're ever going to go home is heartbreaking. So if I would recommend one term for all of you guys, it's called the lifer discount. If there's ever a lifer you can help, whether he's gotten out because his sentence has been commuted or he's been found suitable, always give that guy your first attention. And I do that in my own way. I still talk to the guys inside. I still send them money so they can buy what's called a package, because there's no money in the prison really, right? Or to get a subscription to a magazine, because they don't know if they'll ever go home. And it's just heartbreaking.
So San Quentin is pretty unique in all the programs that they offer for rehabilitation and I mean, they have a wide variety of different programs.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's the ones you think of. NA, AA, they're in there. Churches are in there. They're very good about having Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and Muslim faiths involved, and Buddhism, for that matter, involved in the system. But the programs that have, I believe, have made an even bigger difference are things like nonviolent communication. Now, nonviolent communication sounds simple. It's much harder than you think. It requires you to take ownership of your own emotion. You didn't make me angry. Something you did made me angry. That ability to recognize it's you that has the issue. And then it does a lot with trying to help you express your emotions clearly. My kids, they say they're mad at times. And I say to them, no, you're not, you're frustrated. And trust me, frustration is a very different thing than mad. But they don't recognize it that way. And for many of the guys inside, because they've never had the opportunity to communicate emotionally and clearly, lash out, physically or verbally, in ways that are damaging to themselves, their families, their children. Another program is called Man to Man. And I'm on the board of that as a nonprofit. And we try to teach fatherhood values to these guys who are inside because they're inside. But most of them have children. But unfortunately, they became parents without becoming a true father. Right? They weren't home. They weren't that supported. And they haven't learned those skills at home because many of them didn't have a father themselves. So to help them learn the skills, including things like nonviolent communication and restorative justice, is important for them to be able to reestablish a connection with their own children, with their own families. Because many of them never have a visit when they're in prison. You'll find that guys in prison talk a lot. In fact, I'm probably talking a lot, and I have friends who still think I talk a lot since I've been home. Because you learn to talk in prison in a very different way. And that's a good thing. You'd rather have them talk than a lot of the other stuff. They don't need to self-medicate, express your pain. Compassion Prison Project is another great organization that I've done work with, where they try to help these guys express both the traumas they have caused with their crimes, but the traumas that they experienced always before their crime, unfortunately, that they haven't been able to deal with, usually as children. And that healing process requires you to accept responsibility for the trauma you've caused, but that's not enough. You have to understand the trauma you experienced and understand the defense mechanisms that you built up, usually as a child, to protect yourself from that trauma. But those defense mechanisms become weapons when you're an adult. And those weapons cause more harm and cause trauma to others. And the cycle continues. To break that, you have to go all the way back. So there's another example of an organization, Compassion Prison Project. The one that had the most effect on me was called Victim Offender Education Group. And it was an 18-month program, small group. We had about 8 of us in a circle. I wrote a paper saying the circle is the most powerful tool we have in prison. Because if it's a square, you have corners you can hide in. But in a circle, you can't hide. You're all in there. And this was a group to help people not just go through that process I explained. What trauma did they cause? What trauma had they experienced that they used to justify the trauma they caused? But also how to face their victims. As an adult, as somebody who's responsible for their actions. Now, you normally don't face your victim directly. That's actually against the law in many cases. You're not allowed to communicate with your victim's family. But a victim panel is conveyed. In my case, after 18 months of work, and by the way, not everybody can do it. We started with about 10 guys. We ended with 6. They couldn't handle the honesty that was necessary, the rigorous truth that has to come out in that process of admitting what you had done and what had been done to you. But in that group, we had 4 family members who had lost somebody through crime, whether it was a drunk driver or a shooting or domestic violence, so that we could face them and acknowledge our role in somebody else's life, but the same role, the taker of a life. That's a very powerful group, and one that helped me to heal, not become whole. My scars will never go away, but I guess they're not bleeding openly right now. That group was the best for me, the Victim Offender Education Group. And there's a nonprofit arm outside that helps facilitate, if desired, communications directly with the victims, our victim's family, and the perpetrator of the crime. And that's a very healing aspect as well, because I think the saddest thing, forget about all the people in prison, that's sad. The saddest thing is these victims who never become a survivor. They stay stuck in victimhood, permanently reliving that experience again and again, whether it's through fear or flashbacks, it doesn't really matter. We all need to become survivors, if possible. That's what restorative justice is actually about. It's another group that tries to find conciliation in the community rather than just putting somebody in prison and taking them out of the community. And it's a very powerful tool. So if you see that term, again, in the newspaper, restorative justice is a common one. These practices are there. You can do a search on, just search for victim, and you'll see a lot of articles about these different groups that try to help these guys take responsibility for their actions, not justify them. It's not racism, it's their action, regardless of the environment they came from. They have to own their action before they can ever heal themselves. And hopefully come back to community as a contributing member, as Earlonne has. Amazing the stuff he does. He'll be at that event at the public library and speaking. He goes all over the world We're friends on Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn, you know, I mean, we stay in touch. He couldn't make it today because he had another commitment, but to this group. But, you know, he is flying all over the nation, all over the world to just spread the message that these men can heal. They're not still that teenage criminal that had committed whatever horrendous series of crimes. It's never one crime. I didn't drive drunk and kill someone once. It's just that's the time I killed someone. None of these guys committed one crime. But the point is, how do they break out of that cycle? And Earlonne talks about that and about ear hustle all over the world. So please do listen to that podcast. I think they're in season 8 or 9, I can't remember, but there's a ton of stuff in there that you can hear about these guys' journey, not just their experience there, but their rehabilitation as well. And I think that's important to remember. It's not just prison porn where you're hearing about the prison experience, or crime porn where you hear about their crime, but their actual lived experience as they learn. And I think that's the thing that's probably the saddest for me since I've come home. Most people would say, I've never been involved in the criminal justice system. I never had a ticket, literally. Literally, never had a ticket. But when you're convicted of a felony and you come home, society is so frightened of you that it's very difficult to integrate. This community is accepted. But I'll tell you, even though I'd lived in the city for 15 years, I'd say 90% of my community before now, for whatever reason, has nothing to do with me. And when they do, they treat me as an invalid. Actually, I got a friend I'm going to be house sitting at next month. She's got 2 cats, and I cat sit for her, and she pays me for it to come stay at her house. She's happy that she trusts me in her home. She doesn't invite me to her birthday party. I don't understand that. But that's an example of what all these guys have to go through. So again, a lifer discount, but also just to let them know they're human beings and they're part of the community is such an important lesson for their healing and for the community's healing, and to help these victims stop being victims and become survivors, and not just be afraid all their life. Anyway, too much.
No.
I can't stop.
No, that's why it's important that we read this book and that we listen to the podcast so we can have some compassion and some understanding of what people go through, and then maybe treat you differently, right? That's the whole point. So, and you talked about the rehabilitation programs inside, and I'm sure that, you know, not every incarcerated person takes part in those programs. As, you know, we would like them to, like everyone, you know, we would like them to rehabilitate, but they're not, obviously, maybe they're not interested. Well, could you give like maybe a percentage of incarcerated people who do actually take part and
Well, that's a good question.
And find some sort of
I'm going to get wonky on you guys again, sorry. The California system, first of all, understand that every state has its own prison system. And there's a federal prison system. And there's a local government, city or county jail. So the way to think of it is there are like 3 different levels of incarceration for any individual. They could be in local jail, they could be in state prison, or they could be in federal prison. Those are the 3 levels that exist. And each one of them is different as to percentages and work. In the state system, there are 4 levels of incarceration, 1 through 4. 4 are considered the most violent criminals. And they tend to be on lockdown. They tend to be what are called like supermaxes, or on, they're isolated most of the time. Many of them literally don't come out of their cell for 23 hours a day, 4 years. That's level 4. But even if you're convicted of that type of a violent crime, if you don't commit new crimes in prison, and the longer you're in prison showing that good action, you can reduce your points and come down to a level 3, and then to a level 2. My crime, because I took a life, is hard level 2. I could never become a level 1, which are the easiest prisons that exist. And anybody who's taken a life can't go below level 2. So San Quentin is different because even though most of the men there had committed the most horrific crimes, had started at level 4 prisons, they had been in long enough and had acted well enough within the system to come down to level 2, which is the level there is at San Quentin. My best friend in San Quentin, his name's Clark, even though you probably know him as a Rockefeller, because he pretended to be a Rockefeller for over 20 years. They did a book on him and a number of movies. He's called The Man in the Rockefeller Suit. There's going to be another movie where, believe it or not, Benedict Cumberbatch is going to play him. He started at a level 4 because he had kidnapped his daughter in a divorce thing, and then was later convicted on a murder, double homicide. But because he's been so good in prison and volunteered and worked hard, he's come down to a level 2 now. And even though you may say some people would say my crime is also an accident, it doesn't matter. See, that the difference between intent and impact, we often don't distinguish them enough. The impact was a life was taken, period. That's a clear line. And I said I'm conscientious. I would honor what the state imposed on me. Because I have to tell you, many people still believe in a life for a life. Some of my victims' family believed in a life for a life. But the state sentenced me to 7 years, 8 months. A lot longer than my 6 and 8-year-old kids would have wanted. A lot less than many members of my victims' family would have wanted. But that's what the state decided. It removed a lot of that emotional passion by having laws in place. In theory, that's the way it's supposed to work. In practice, many people still stay afraid. And prison is the punishment. Unfortunately, what we haven't talked a lot about is prison itself is an extra punishment many times. Removing you from society is supposed to be the punishment. I lived in a dorm with 200 men in double metal bunks. I now spend a lot of time in solitude, believe it or not, listening mainly to jazz and classical music. If I never have to hear rap music again, I'll be the happiest man in the world, ever, ever. But in prison, you have no privacy. You take a shower in front of everybody. You go to the bathroom in front of everybody. 200 men for 6 years. I'll give you a point that you probably wouldn't even imagine knowing that. And overcrowding is a big thing. When I was in county jail, we had triple bunks and mattresses in the common area because there were so many people in county jail. Partly because guys were in there for 6 years instead of for the short time county jail was meant for. The average cost on budget to feed an inmate is about $2.50 a day. High carbs, you have a lot of people who get type 2 diabetes in prison because you're eating a lot of bread and bread-like products. Turkey bologna every once in a while, peanut butter, just things like that. How much do you guys think it costs to incarcerate somebody for a year? And this is last year's numbers that I've got, and it's doubled since I started. That'll give you a little hint. How much do you think it costs to incarcerate somebody in California? Anybody got a guess?
$30,000. $30,000.
$35,000 is the federal cost. That's a good guess.
For 1 year.
Anybody else? Yeah, for a year.
One prisoner 1 year? One prisoner 1 year?
Knowing you're spending $250 a day for his meals, right? I mean, that's an ongoing expense.
$2.50.
When I went to prison, it was $70,000 per inmate in California. Today, it's $130,000 per inmate. That's coming out of your guys' taxes.
Per year.
Per year. $130,000, that's the average, per inmate in the California system. And by the way, they're not, we talk about these groups that come and help people. Those are all volunteer groups. Nobody's getting paid for that, right? That's not the state paying for that. Even when there's education in the system, it's paid for by the federal government, not by the state government. they're going to reinstitute what are called Pell Grants, so that students can get a college education, for example. That had been done away with for about 15, 20 years. They're going to bring it back so these guys can get an education. Another very valuable tool for them to learn how to control their passions is to get an education. The average reading level in prison, I believe, is the 8th grade, and many are much below that. And don't take advantage of that opportunity. Back to your point, in my prison, many of the inmates, well over 50% at San Quentin, worked in programs. At most prisons, I would say it's a much lower percentage. Because first of all, if you're locked in your cell 23 hours a day, or you're in solitary confinement permanently, I know guys who've been in solitary confinement for 8 years. Never seen another human being. A meal comes in through the slot. When you go out for your break for an hour a day, nobody else is allowed to be around. You see the guards walking by. That's it. For 8 years. Those prisons, it's hard to measure because you don't have that interaction. They don't have the volunteer groups. How many would take advantage of these? I bet it would be a lot more if they had access to them. But they don't.
So among the population, did you find that a lot of the incarcerated people,
Thank you.
I like to use that language.
Incarcerated person, and I call myself a returning citizen,
Yeah.
is the term I like to use, because I take citizenship seriously. I violated my duty as a citizen, and society imposed a penalty on that. But I'm a citizen. I paid that penalty. Not gladly, don't get me wrong, but honorably. I got over 500 days of what's called good time and milestone credit. So even though I was sentenced to 7 years, 8 months, I served 6 years, 3 months. A lot of guys can get out a lot sooner than that if they have good time credit. But my crime, because it was considered a violent crime, required me to serve 85% of my sentence, basically. So that's why I couldn't go lower than that. Or I would have. I never had a violation in prison. You know, I played by the rules. But a lot of guys don't.
So were there a lot of incarcerated people listening to the podcast?
You can't listen to it.
Oh, you can't?
Well, you could listen to it if it's brought. Think of prison as if you're in a time machine back to 1980. Okay. There are payphones on the wall, 4 of them for 200 men, in my case, where you can make a collect call. Maximum 15 minutes. Now, that sounds, okay, I'll get in line, I'll make that call. The sign above there, above the phones, is please don't put your hands in your pants when you're on the phone. Do you think you want to talk to your 8-year-old kid when the 3 guys next to you are having conversations you don't want to hear? And you don't want them listening to you, to be honest. So it's like 1980 payphones. TV is broadcast TV. Like with the antenna. Seriously, they make their own antennas to get broadcast TV. I don't know if you know that. You can still get broadcast TV if you try. To listen to local channels. And radio is old school radio. You know, you can't choose when you listen to a song or a show. You listen to something. Unfortunately, that isn't broadcast through the air on Ear Hustle. So no, they can't listen to it.
I had no idea that they couldn't hear it.
Oh, that's not the only thing I go in the past. They all still have their same hairstyles from when they went to prison. Ponytails, fros, jerry curls, flat tops, all the same. They don't change. For them, time has stopped when they go to prison. Stopped when they got sent in. So many of them have no idea what the internet really is. Even me, when I went to prison, I had a BlackBerry. You know, I had to learn the iPhone after I got out. So many of these guys have never used a smartphone or a computer. They might see it on TV, broadcast TV, but not have a personal understanding of it. And that's quite an impediment for them to reintegrate into society. One of the groups I was involved with was called Bonafide Life. They met me. So My family didn't meet me when I got out. A friend came and Bonafide Life met me when I got out. And they took me to a Target, gave me a $200 limit to buy some clothes. Fed me breakfast first. A friend came, gave me a $35 burner phone, cell phone, so I could call people, talk to them. That group is a great group. It meets you on your way out, helps people to integrate, gives you a phone, for example, trains you on how to use it. Most doesn't. They literally come out like they have time travel. And that includes their language, their vocabulary, their mindset. Much of our more egalitarian values here aren't nearly as common inside prison, whether it's racism, sexism, whatever else you want to say. They're still locked, like Archie Bunker in the past. It's true.
Can we open up for other audience members to ask you some
Of course.
questions? Would anyone else like to ask a question of Wayne? Yes, what's your name? Sorry.
Faye,
Hi, Faye.
what are the specific reasons why you committed a crime, and how long were you in parole, and are you still on parole?
No, I'm not. I'm off parole. I had a 3-year parole, and I served 2 for good time. Got my passport again. But when you're on parole, you're supposed to release to either your county of residence or the county you committed your crime in. Even though I committed my crime in what's called Kings County, my drunk driving experience was on the 5 freeway, where I killed someone. And it was down in Kings County. Normally they'd release me there, but because my county residence is San Francisco, I was able to be released here for 2 years.
New York? Kings County, New York?
No, it's down near Fresno.
Oh.
It's a middle nowhere.
Okay.
Trust me.
No, you just said you were from New York
Yeah.
before, so.
Yeah.
So you were involved with a car accident? How did
Yeah.
you end up killing that person? What happened?
Well, I was on the 5 freeway and had a head-on collision.
They locked you in prison for something like that? You died from it?
Excuse
You
me?
died from an accident, collision,
Yeah.
person? That's why you were in prison for
Yeah.
7 years?
He was.
Were you drunk driving? You were drunk
Yeah.
driving?
Yeah.
They gonna lock you in prison
We have-
that long?
Hey, there's another question over here.
Yes. Hi,
I'm
sorry.
not sure I heard you correctly, but I think you said a lot of people are in there for accidents, but most criminal law is for non-accidental,
Correct.
you know, the purpose. So do you see your situation as accidental?
No. I committed a crime. I
What
violated
did you mean by that
societal
statement,
standards.
or did I misunderstand? You said that, I thought you said that there are a lot of people in prison who are there just because of accidents.
No,
Okay.
I didn't say that. But one type of subgroup are called 3 strikers. I don't know if you've heard that term,
Yeah.
3 strikers. Now, the law sounds reasonable on its face. If you've committed 3 felonies, we're not going to let you out until you're found suitable by the parole board. So you're not in, it's not permanently for life, it's called an indeterminate life sentence. Curtis Roberts, the guy I mentioned, he was sentenced to an indeterminate life sentence, but he had to be found suitable at parole. One guy I know, Kenny Bryden, who was in there, he committed a murder, was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. At the 20-year mark, he was found suitable by the parole board to come out. The governor at that time, Deukmejian, revoked his parole. He ended up serving 38 years. And in prison, we say life means life, meaning whether you're on a life sentence that's like a first-degree murder conviction, or you're on a life indeterminate life sentence, doesn't really matter because so few people are found suitable. It's this real weird counterintuitive thing of over-policing and under-policing at the same time that exists. The recidivism rate, the people who commit crimes again, who are found suitable for parole, is under 1% if they've committed a homicide. So they're very safe when they get out. But even today, with two long-term governors who are obviously for criminal justice reform, the highest it's ever gotten is 20% are found suitable for parole. And they don't get to go every year. I know a guy who just got denied for 10 years or not. He can't go back to the parole board for 10 years. He served his determinate sentence, but it doesn't matter. It goes on and on and on. Like my friend Kenny, who was found suitable after 20 years, then it was revoked by the governor, had to wait for 38 years till he was found suitable again, and the governor at that time, didn't revoke it, and he was able to come out. We went to a Giants game last season with 3 other guys, 3 other lifers. And to take him to a Giants game after serving 38 years, and he's got a girlfriend, and he's got to start his life, he's got a car. It's wonderful that he's been given that second chance, and it is given. He doesn't deserve it per se, but he's taking advantage of it, and I really admire that. And I was happy to help him celebrate that.
Did he change his hairstyle?
Yes. Thank God. One of the advantages of a girlfriend for most men is it helps with their style all across the board, not just their hair.
Wait,
Okay, life is a series of choices. Now, you put yourself in that situation because you chose to drive drunk.
Correct.
I've had a head-on collision here in San Francisco myself. My mother was in a car. She told me this. I will never forget this. She was on Folsom Street back in the 60s, and my uncle, Mike, ran over somebody and killed somebody.
And they know him? Did they know him? Did they know that person?
No, he just was driving on
Stranger?
Folsom Street and ran over and killed somebody.
Was he in prison?
No, they sent him, at that time, they sent him to jail for like weekends for a couple of years, but they would let him out during the week to go to his job, see? And that's what happened at that time. And for example, like you were mentioning how much it costs to feed inmates when they're in jail. I've never been in prison in my life. I've done a lot of crimes in my life, but I've never, but I've been only in county jail, like 850 Bryant, 6th floor, they got a big gray building down there.
Sure.
But I've never really gotten any serious trouble because, like I said, one time I got in a head-on collision in the city, and that other car was wiped out.
And your question is?
My question is, when did your crime take place? And what happened?
It was in 2000.
Because I missed the beginning of your story, I was a little bit late here.
It was in 2011.
Uh-huh.
In my case, I was going through a really tough time. I had started seeing a psychiatrist, but it didn't help me stop drinking. In my case, I had to go down to LA 6 times in a 4-month period because my mom was in hospice. And I have a special needs brother, so I was trying to rearrange their life. And that included finding an assisted living facility that would take both of them versus just her. Because they were codependent. They had lived together their whole life. I couldn't separate them. And in my case, the crime was committed the night after I had turned them into their assisted living facility and had to clean out their apartment. Now the drunk driving part, the choices part, for me, was I thought it was a smart idea to drink a bottle of vodka and Red Bulls to help clean out their apartment. But then I kept drinking. And then I tried to drive home to San Francisco. Drinking on the way, don't misunderstand me. I did that. And my weakness was that I used that form of self-medication rather than reaching out more to my community to get help. I had friends who would offer to drive down with me. Too proud to have them help me. No, deal with my family myself. And unfortunately, I was too weak. I couldn't deal with it. Facing that has been a long journey for me. And that ability for introspection, to understand what you did, and try to find out why you did it. And then to be able to express that. That creative self-expression can come out in many forms, not just talking. I use writing a lot. Earlonne used storytelling and talks. Other people write music, or sing, or do art. There are ways to be self-expressed, and that's essential for people to be able to express themselves authentically in whatever form works for them. But then the next stage becomes some form of service, where you help others on that journey, and all three of them are occurring at the same time. But it's that process of introspection, self-expression in some creative form, and then service. Those are the three phases that I think everybody has to go through, and what restorative justice is really about in the prison system. But that process of introspection includes facing your community and what you did with your crime. Now, in my case, I did a lot of AA when I was in prison to try to understand why I was drinking. But I also saw a psychiatrist. I also talked to psychologists. I also took these different groups because I had to understand what was it about me that I thought it made sense to drink Red Bull vodkas and drive.
Wayne, could you?
Amazing.
Wayne, could you share? You gave me a statistic when we were talking about this, about lifers in California versus the rest of the country, which I found, I mean, as a numbers person, I found that really fascinating. Would you share that?
You bet. You guys think California is a liberal state.
No, I don't.
Relative to most states. The prison system is not, in any way. For example, I talked to you about these indeterminate life sentences. There are 30,000 men on those life sentences. The next closest state is hardcore Texas. They've only got 8,000 men.
Wow.
At that status. That's how out of balance California is to the rest of the nation. The only other states that have a similar percentage, I think, are Utah and Alabama, but much fewer numbers because we have a much larger criminal system. And that indeterminate life sentence could come from that 3 strikes that I mentioned. So if you're committed 3 felonies, then you're on an indeterminate life sentence, guaranteed. Even if your 3rd felony, I had a cellie when I first went to prison. He had stolen 6 cartons of cigarettes from a Costco. That was his 3rd felony, his 3rd strike. That put him in prison for over 20 years. Now,
If you haven't read the book or listened to the podcast, Cellie is your cellmate. I don't know if any of you knew that.
I think we have
so that system is very out of balance in California. Much of that is driven by what's called the 3-strike law that has people stay in. And see, the thing is, you think of 3 strikes as 3 different swings at the bat. Some people could get 3 strikes the first time they're arrested because the prosecution will pile on crimes. So let me give you an idea. You think of a concurrent sentence or a consecutive sentence. Now, if you commit a crime, you might think that those sentences are concurrent. You have 3 different sentences, say 5, 7, and 10 years, and you'd serve 10 and that satisfies all 3. But no, they're consecutive. You serve 5, then you serve 7, then you serve 10. And if you have what's called a gang enhancement, you get an extra 10 years. And if you have a gun enhancement, you have an extra 5 years. And so those times could go on for a very long time. That's why it's down to about 100,000 now. When I was in, it was about 130,000 in the state system. But it's a lot of guys, 30,000 of which are on indeterminate life sentences. A little less. There's 700 on death row. That's a different story. But they're part of that 30,000.
We're going to do one last question and then we're going to...
I have a question. I'm new to California, but I know I'm from Chicago originally. But the question I have is because there are these 3-strike and indeterminate sentences, I know in other states a lot of prisons have been built because of that, and a lot more people are in, and you have communities that are dependent for their economics on that prison. Is that a part of what happens in California? Because you say the governor doesn't want to commute those because...
It's not that simple.
I know.
The way the system works, I'll give you an example. The laws sound fair, but they're not applied fairly. So for example, under the law, the parole board is supposed to have a presumption of suitability when you come before the board. And then somebody would have to the state, whether it's the prison or the VA that arrested you, need to come in and say, no, he shouldn't be found suitable. But there should be a presumption, just like there's a presumption of innocence when you get a crime, there should be a presumption of suitability. The rate was well under 2% for decades. It got up to close to 10% under Governor Brown. It got up to as high as 20% for Governor Newsom. It's dropped back down to about 15% are found suitable. But remember, they don't get to go before the board every year.
But is that?
Some of them could be 3 years, 5 years, 10 years between going to the parole board to see if they're found suitable. Even though there's a presumption of suitability, the vast majority are not found
But
suitable.
the question I have really is because there's been an economic incentive to build prisons.
Yes.
And employ people from the community in those prisons. My understanding in a lot of cases is they don't want to let a lot of people go free and
It's a money
reduce the
machine.
prison population because a community is dependent economically on having that prison.
They're not making money off of it. It's prison business.
Oh, they are.
I actually
Yes,
think-
they are.
I actually think indifference and incompetence are just as big as incentives. So they recently, a lot of guys in prison can dramatically reduce their sentence if they become firefighters. You might have heard of this. If they're able to be firefighters at the forest fires, right? They don't do it in the city, they do forest fires. Thousands of them go to fire camps. Many of them only have to serve 1/3 of their sentence if they volunteer to go to a fire camp. And last year they passed a law. These guys, by the way, when they got out of prison, because they've been convicted of felony, they couldn't become a firefighter as a job. They can only do it as a prisoner, earning $1 a day. $1 an hour during a fire, $1 a day if there isn't a fire. But if they're fighting fire, it's $1 an hour. When they're out there putting their lives at risk to put out these big fires. So they passed a law that said, okay, that's not fair. That just because you're convicted of a felon, you've been trained as a firefighter while in prison, you should be able to be a firefighter now. That sounds fair. Oh, great, the state's changed that. What they don't tell you is the person has to go to court to get their felony removed so they can become a firefighter. How many people can afford to hire an attorney when they get out of prison? This is what institutional racism is about, if you want to know the truth. Right there. Right there, it's to act like it's colorblind. Yes, it's colorblind. But who has the money to hire an attorney to get their felony off their record so they can then become a firefighter? Not the poor people. Who are the poor people? Well, they tend to be people of color, let's be honest. And they're not able to take advantage of these laws. On its face, it sounds wonderful. We all should feel good that we've reformed our criminal justice system. But in reality, that's not how it works. And it's heartbreaking. It's just heartbreaking.
Question.
I think we're going to wrap up. If you have a question for Wayne, maybe you can, just like 5 minutes and you can ask him. But thank you all for being here. Please listen to the podcast, read the book. If you can go to the event, please, if you have one.
And San Quentin News.
And read the San Quentin News.
Can I watch this on online?
A lot of them. Even by my friend Rockefeller.
Yeah.
He wrote a story about how inflation has impacted the guys in prison.